So we're approaching 5 to 6 now. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I've not met me before, my name is Richard Pout. I'm going to be hosting the sessions this evening. Just while we're waiting, as I said before, if you'd like to include in the chat where you're from at the moment, where you're viewing these presentations. Just a kind of aside, really, a bit of an anecdote. This afternoon I was in the supporting the Taking Stock tour, which is currently happening on a fairly regular basis in galleries 17 and 18. Now, that probably won't mean an awful lot to anybody, but it's right at the top of the building. But what we've got there is a fantastic collection of all the, or a vast majority of the items in our Manchester Art Gallery collection, which are, as it says, in store, and we are in the process, many people in the gallery are in the process of looking at the work and in a sense, cataloguing it, doing more research, finding out about it. There are tours available, sessions available, for anybody who wishes to come and have a look at that, but they are only bookable online. There's a limit to the number of people who are able to attend at each session, and that's 12. If you are interested in doing that, then do go to the Manchester Art Gallery website, look for Taking Stock, and you can follow the guidance to fill in your details. We had Kate Jessens this afternoon, who is constantly fascinating in terms of the amount of information that she's able to bring to our collection. I'm always amazed by the kind of things that we find out. Every time we go in, there's something new. We also have some of the conservation team who give a different perspective on our collection. Certainly looking at things like the conservation of images, but also the conservation of frames, how images and works are protected. None of the pieces that we've got in the Taking Stock gallery spaces are exhibition ready. They're all in different states of conservation, and that in itself is quite interesting to have a look at. And I think those people who've been part of the Taking Stock tours have found some really intriguing pieces of information and some revelations in relation to some of the artwork. As I said, the tours are bookable online, completely free, but I would encourage you to go and have a look at that. And if you've not had the opportunity to go and participate in the Taking Stock tours, I'd certainly encourage you to do that. It'd be interesting to hear if anybody's actually been able to have a look at that and any insights that you gain from being part of those tours. So we're just coming up to 6 o'clock. We've got 16 people in at the moment. We probably have a few more by the time we get to 6. I don't really want to spend any more of our presenters' time talking about things, but I thought it was quite useful to kind of make people aware of that opportunity that we've got in the gallery. It's in many cases it's quite unique for a gallery to be able to show the things that are in store and not usually available to see by visitors. So, as I said, we're just coming up to 6 o'clock. Welcome everybody. We've got one. Oh, Andrew's joining us from sunny Dubai. Welcome, Andrew. I'm not sure what time it is in Dubai. It must be sometime in. Perhaps you could advise me what time it is in Dubai at the moment. So, yeah, we're increasing the number of people that are joining us. Just like to welcome everybody this evening. We've got two presentations for you this evening. Both presenters probably extremely well known to you, been participating in these Friends tours before. We have Lindsay Porter, who's one of the very well established guides in the museum. Some of you may have been on some of Lindsay's tours, and she's going to be talking about feminine natures, looking at a selection of artworks, both well established and also new artworks that we've brought into the collection. And then well established and I was going to say long term, but I won't. Well-established guide, John Ward, who's going to be with us, and he's going to be talking about Britain's first awakening into Impressionism. So each one of these tours, every time I listen to the tours, I always learn something new. And I'm sure we will learn a great deal from the talks from both Lindsay and from John. If you have any questions or discussion points that arise during the presentations, then please add them to the chat. We also ask you to mute and stop your video because sometimes we get extraneous noises interrupting the presentations. So it's helpful to us to make sure those are both crossed out. And if you've got a screen set up like mine, the mute and the stop video icons are in the bottom left-hand side. So I believe this is now 6 o'clock. I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to hand over to Lindsay and we look forward to her presentation. Lindsay, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This talk was inspired by this year's acquisition. Are we okay? Something went a bit funny with the sound. So this talk was inspired by this year's acquisition of Ruth Murray's Duff, currently on display in Gallery 7. I had first encountered the work by accident, and Ruth Murray's painting stopped me in my tracks. If you haven't seen it in person, it's on a grand scale. It's over 2 meters tall and nearly as wide, and it looms before the viewer, the figure within it almost life-size. I found it intriguing and perplexing. The figure's expression is unreadable, and her situation is ambiguous. She seems settled in her surroundings, but it does not look the most comfortable of situations. Is she caught? Is she trapped? How did she get there? There are echoes of fairy tales, the flash of red recalling the little hooded girl in the wood, the brambles evoking the thorny barrier that grew around the Sleeping Beauty's castle. Yet the clothes are contemporary and the girl is awake. I knew nothing of the artist at the time I first saw this painting, but I enjoyed its ambiguous imagery and the almost hyper-reality of its depiction of the natural world. In today's culture, the lone young woman lying in a landscape is a hackneyed trope used at the beginning of a thriller and often in multiple flashbacks to set a plot in motion. She's often dead or dying or terrified and unsuccessfully trying to outrun her aggressor. Ruth Murray's figure appears very much alive, but we cannot read her expression. Her interior life is withheld from us, but there is something about her face which suggests it is rich and complex. While these multiple impressions were leading me to make other mental leaps and connections, I was aware of the gallery's inspired choice of location next to Millet's Autumn Leaves, a very different painting of young women in a landscape, but one that portrays a similar time of year and employs a not dissimilar color palette. it led me to think about depictions of women in landscapes, both in Manchester Art Gallery and throughout Western art generally, and led me to think how, and indeed if, Ruth Murray's painting related to this tradition, which is now the subject of this talk. Ruth Murray was born in 1984 and originally from Birmingham. She trained at Loughborough University and then the Royal College of Art, and she now works from her studio in Manchester. She says of her work, "My paintings are about the experiences of women, and most of my paintings are of women in a scene. Sometimes I use these women to evoke feelings of alienation and paranoia. There is a tense feeling, but I also look for the quiet beauty in mourning or isolation, so there can be a kind of languorous, contemplative aspect to them as well. I'm working against traditional depictions of women in nature, even if that makes them less comfortable than one would expect. I paint with a lot of detail. It's the messy, chaotic quality of many organic, natural forms. At close range, they dissolve into patterns and surfaces and can establish striking correspondences. For my work in nature, I'm interested in capturing the emotion and feeling of a place, the personal, human, primal response to it. All of these elements, I feel, can be seen in Duff, whose title is the word for the decaying plant matter found under trees. We will have the opportunity to look at other of her works and to see how they also embody her statement. But first, I thought it would be interesting to do an art. Sorry, I think there's a feedback or some kind of sound. At first, I thought it would be interesting to do an art historical dive into depictions of women in Western art to see what it is Ruth Murray might be responding to and reacting against. So there are several traditions that immediately spring to mind, two dating back to the classical world. The first is that of metamorphosis, described in Ovid's collection of stories of the same name, dating from the year 8. In Ovid's stories, mortals, men and women, undergo transformations by the gods into animals, plant life, natural phenomena, sometimes as punishment, but equally as often as reward or to provide sanctuary. Actaeon, you may remember, was transformed into a deer by the goddess Diana as retribution for spying on her and her nymphs bathing. He was hunted by his own hounds and devoured. Baucis and Philemon were transformed after their death into entwined trees, an oak and a linden, as reward and example for their marital fidelity. And young women, so many young women, are bestowed with the gift of physical transformation as a way of saving them from assault by a rapacious god. The wood nymph Syrinx, pursued by Pan, is transformed into a reed along a riverbank. Daphne, chased by a relentless Apollo, becomes a laurel tree. These stories and imagery inspired artists from that point on. Manchester Art Gallery's own Syrinx by Arthur Hacker, here on the left, depicts the nymph prior to transformation, but among the reeds that she will soon resemble. It's hard to avoid the suspicion that it provides an excuse to enjoy the supple form of the young model, likening her to the grace of the surrounding plant life. In this, Hacker was working within a tradition of rendering the nude respectable, erudite even, with its classical allusions. Yet the model's vulnerability and fear is also evident. One senses her almost shrinking among the reeds. Is this a foreshadowing of transformation or an acknowledgement of her powerlessness? Is it meant to instill empathy in the viewer or a frisson? Artists clearly are free to choose which point in the narrative to depict. Often it is a dramatic scene of pursuit or the moment immediately prior to transformation, as the god descends upon his prey, allowing for an artistic contortion of bodies, of displays of assault and retreat, of power and submission. More creative and often unintentionally entertaining to me is the depiction of the metamorphosis itself, allowing the artistic imagination free rein. For that, we can look at various depictions of Daphne at the point at which she begins to transform into a laurel tree. So on the right is Piero del Polaiolo's 15th century Apollo and Daphne at the National Gallery. The god, fashionably dressed as an Italian nobleman, clutches an equally beautifully dressed Daphne as she begins her metamorphosis. We notice first, it would be hard not to, her outstretched arms transformed into branches, filling half the picture frame. Her right leg, the last of her human limbs, performs a graceful arabesque in counterpoint to her left leg, which is hidden among the shadows, taking root as the solid trunk of a tree. How a woman might transform into a tree incited the imagination. Bernini's Apollo and Daphne on the left alludes to this minimally, the leaves emerging from graceful fingertips, a visual counterpart to her frond-like curls. In the center, Luigi Admello's Apollo and Daphne references Apollo's subsequent worship of the laurel leaf, yet retains the spirit of the original women in his depiction of the tree, as though her soul remained trapped within. A surreal depiction is this one here on the right. It's of a 15th century illumination in which a medieval Apollo appears to abandon his pursuit as a triumphant Daphne strides past him, laurel tree head held high. It is one of several illustrations for Christine de Pisan's Handbook of Advice for Young Nobles, L'Epistre of Thea. Christine de Pisan is considered to have created some of the earliest feminist texts, and I don't think it's any coincidence that this image is the only one that implies Daphne has agency. As well as a millennials-old tradition of female figures undergoing transformation, the natural world has been presented as an allegory of a feminine spirit. We refer to Mother Earth and Mother Nature, which implies nurturing, fertility, and protectiveness. But the classical world recognized other aspects of nature, its wildness, its unknowability, its fickleness, fragility, and its dangerousness. And these features were personified through the figures of nymphs. There are nymphs of the water, naiads, nymphs of the forest, dryads, nymphs of mountains and grottos, nymphs for breezes, nymphs for the sunset, for groves, meadows, plants, flowers, and water. The word nymph comes from the Greek word meaning bride and veiled, and refers to a marriageable young woman. Most depictions of nymphs show them at their most alluring, that often they are deadly, and their treachery is disguised behind deceptively innocent-looking demeanors. Perhaps one of the best known depictions of the nymph is Waterhouse's Hylas of the Nymphs, one of the gallery's most popular paintings. I'm not going to dwell on the controversy that arose when the painting was temporarily removed in 2019, but it is interesting to compare it to other images of nymphs. So according to myth, Hylas was the companion of Hercules on the ship the Argo. Landing on an island, Hylas goes in search of water. Different versions describe his fate. He falls in love with a nymph and he stays with her. He is taken in and cared for by the nymphs, or, as is often depicted, he is lured to a watery death. In any case, Hercules searches the island for Hylas, but he is never seen again. Waterhouse depicts the moment of encounter, but not the denouement. His nymphs are physically beguiling, but unknowable, a blank slate on which the viewer can impose their own interpretation. Hylas's face in shadow is difficult to read, his gaze locked with one of the nymphs. Not much is known about Waterhouse's models, although it has been suggested that he returned to the same one over again. In Hylas, the nymphs are all the same model, underlining their non-human identity. They are water in human form, not individuals, but an endlessly replicated personification of a natural phenomenon. It's a very different mood to the painting of the same scene by William Etty here on the left, in which the nymphs appear to be not so much luring Hylas as wrestling him into the water. A 3rd century Roman mosaic of the same scene also depicts a moment of physical altercation. The nymphs are as solidly rendered as Hylas, their watery attributes indicated by the water jugs. Henrietta Ray's Hylas and the Nymphs in the bottom right there of 1909 is closest to Waterhouse's approach, depicting the beauty of the surroundings and the same plant life, the irises and the water lilies, with as much care as the unfolding scene. Painted when the artist was 50, it is typical of her style in its scale and depiction of classical subject matter. And I would argue that she does not bring a particularly female approach to her subject matter. The depiction is within the tradition of Victorian classical themes, particularly that of Lawrence Alma Teddemeyer, one of her teachers. For a more striking, even revolutionary approach to this mythological theme, we can look to the works of Annie Swinnerton. Some of you may remember the retrospective exhibition held in Manchester Art Gallery in 2018, the first in the city since she was made an Associate Royal Academician in 1923. Swinnerton was trained in Manchester, but she spent the rest of her life living and working in London and in Italy, where she thrived artistically in the strong Italian sunlight. Oceanid of 1904, almost contemporaneous with Henrietta Ray's Nymphs, but very different in approach, is one of my favorite of her works and is an interesting counterpoint to the previous examples of women in landscapes. The title refers to this tradition in name only and depicts a very different figure and relationship with the natural world. Her Oceanid, an ocean nymph, creates an almost visceral response in the viewer. You can compare the robust physicality of the woman in the water to Waterhouse's graceful yet insubstantial figures. The sensation of water and sunlight on the skin is so enticingly rendered, one feels one could dive into the painting. It's a celebration of the physicality of the body in nature and feels as much a physical response to the enjoyment of the heat of the sun and the coolness of the water as an aesthetic one. Swinnerton was a supporter of women's suffrage, and her rendering of the female nude is often viewed through that lens. Her work certainly appealed to suffragists and fellow women artists who, among other things, appreciated her truth to the individuality of her models. For an allegorical rendering of the female nude in Annie Swinnerton's work, we need to look to Montagna Mia, My Mountain, painted nearly 20 years after Oceanid. It is an almost symbolist depiction of the female figure. Now it has merged with the landscape to embody it. And although there is no specific narrative, it suggests a moment of transformation, inviting comparisons to Ovid's myths. Here, however, rather than transformation as punishment or sanctuary, the image suggests an almost ecstatic relationship with the natural world. A critic at the time questioned its success, however, writing, "Montagna Mia is visionary but a little vague. There is an incongruity in the conception of a nude figure melting into a mountain, which Swinnerton has not overcome by all her richness of colour and simplification of form." Other critics, however, have seen in its half-render from the rock of the mountain an allusion to a description often attributed to Michelangelo, that every block of stone contains a statue that the artist has only to reveal. I would argue that the image suggests a transcendence of the corporeal, evoking the artist's delight in and sense of fulfillment from the natural world. With these different traditions, then, the transformative, the allegorical, and the sensually embodied, let us look more closely at Ruth Murray's work. Duff is a large canvas rendered in oil, its meticulous brushwork capturing the natural world in a kind of hyperreal high definition, ironically not dissimilar to the pre-Raphaelites in their original manifesto, but one that they abandoned a short time later by the likes of Millet in Autumn Leaves. The splash of autumnal colour draws us in, but it is the color of the clothing rather than the surrounding nature, which is the monochrome of leafless branches and twigs. Perhaps it is wintertime. Her clothing doesn't provide as many clues as we might think. She is not dressed for cold weather, and nor is her outfit completely contemporaneous. There is a timelessness and an out of timeliness about the image, and she gazes upwards, not necessarily uncomfortable, but neither completely at ease. It is the mystery of her situation and her response to it which is so intriguing and so unsettling. This theme is revisited in other of her paintings. 2021's Fløyen, whose title refers to a mountain in Norway, seems to resolve some of the tension of the earlier work. The figure, again, gazing upwards, again dressed in an outfit that is slightly difficult to pinpoint in time. This time seems to be in the more comfortable surroundings of hay. In fact, until you see the twisted branches and trunks at the top of the canvas, one might mistake her for being in a barn. She appears lost in thought, and her hands clasped across her abdomen suggest ease, in contrast to the slightly awkward pose of Duff. Two smaller, undated oils depict female figures prone in the landscape. Anna appears to be the model in Duff, and although her face is angled towards the viewer, her open eyes look past us. There is no meeting of the gaze, no polite interaction with the viewer or artist. Her bright gaze suggests to me an alert consciousness, but it is difficult to ignore the pop cultural tropes referred to at the beginning of this talk of the lone and vulnerable girl in the wood. Puddle is a variation on this theme, this time positioning the figure in water, equally enigmatic and equally unsettling. It might bring to mind that very famous image of another young woman in water, Millet's Ophelia. And yet we know that Ruth Murray's figure is not in danger of drowning. Ruth Murray's work to me is like a many-layered puzzle, a riddle within a riddle. There is the ambiguous relationship between her figures and the landscape, and the puzzle of why they are there, is heightened by the fact they don't seem entirely uncomfortable nor completely at ease. But I think she is using these enigmatic scenarios to tell us something else about the place of young women in the world, something to suggest inner lives that are complicated and strange and just beyond our reach as viewers. This becomes more evident in the paintings that suggest an element of game playing or a rite or a ritual. Look, for example, of Red Shape. There are interesting echoes with our previous images of women in water. The deep greens, the dark, water-drenched hair, and the duplicated figures bring Waterhouse's nymphs to mind. And yet the turned backs and the odd moss-drenched object that draws their attention, a remnant of what exactly, suggests they have an absorbing relationship with the world that does not invite us in. In Rope, it is as though the viewer is interrupting two young girls at their game or task, coiling, untangling, perhaps stringing the titular rope along the riverbank. Whatever the girls were doing, they did it wholeheartedly, as they are up to their elbows in mud. This wild abandon, with no care for the state of their clothes, is unsettling in girls of their age, who are surely too old to be children making mud pies. One of the girls looks out at the viewer as though directly challenging our interpretation. Do we detect a hint of menace, perhaps, in her gaze? The two looped shapes in the rope contribute to this unease. I can't be alone in seeing the suggestion of a noose. Or is it simply that we do not expect young women to be so absorbed in their activity in the natural world, so at one with their surroundings, so oblivious to societal expectations, that we intuit transgression where there is none? Ritual is made more explicit in The Pyre, here on the left, in which a young woman in a winter landscape runs from the structure she's just completed, the last of the red ribbons trailing from her hand. We see again characteristics of Ruth Murray's work, the vivid flashes of color in the wintry landscape, the intensely observed natural world. Like Rope, the girl is hastily, carelessly dressed, suggesting spontaneity, a rushing headlong into the forest, a wild giddiness. The activities in these works are depicted as interrupted moments in time. The viewer is not a voyeur so much as an intruder. What the young women are doing and what their relationship is with the natural world is left for us to wonder. Unlike the more traditional depictions we looked at earlier, these images suggest a rich interior life, complex, messy, perhaps unkind, and one that we are not privy to. And as a very obvious contrast, we can think of the way in which the girls in Autumn Leaves are essentially performing a picturesque task for the artist and viewer, one whose value is essentially aesthetic and symbolic rather than practical. I think it highly unlikely that the four girls are going to clear the entire estate of the fallen leaves in any meaningful way. I particularly like in Ruth Murray's work a comparison, the way that she depicts the same subject but to very different ends, a barefoot stepping into shallow water. In both paintings here on the right-hand side, she has rendered a fairly ordinary activity enigmatic and destabilizing. On the top right, we have Skomerkdekt, named for a lake in Norway where she held a residency. For those unfamiliar with the location, however, the title has an enticing incantatory quality, and the tentative appearance of the feet and the hem of the skirt seen only in reflection evoke a character in a fairy tale. The offering, ostensibly the same subject, has an entirely different power. The water seems almost to gurgle and roil around the bare feet. The strong diagonal lines across the ankles are ambiguous. Are they plant life or perhaps an injury? Further to the top of the painting, something about the quality of the skin seems awry. What exactly is being offered, and to whom? I want to end with a painting, one of my favorite paintings of Ruth Murray's, called Atom Smashing, which combines all of these elements. A beautifully, even forensically detailed rendering of the natural world and a specific time of year and day, as well as an act of joyful, exuberant silliness, but one which carries echoes of ancient rites or rituals. The swirling girls are modern-day bacchantes, in lab coats and protective goggles, dancing in a circle around what appears to be a piñata hanging from an autumnal tree. The low sun evoking the equinox, perhaps, the changing of seasons and pagan rites. As with the pyre, they are absorbed in their self-contained world, entirely heedless of us, the viewer. And so this brings us back to where we began, cast back into that sylvan world of classical myth, as though we have accidentally stumbled upon a scene that is not for us mortals. The difference to me is that cumulatively, Ruth Murray's girls are very much the protagonists of their own stories. They are not blank slates on which to impose our own narrative. They are neither passive nor treacherous nymphs, interpreted through the lens of an often male-centered story. But they appear to represent a complicated selfhood in all its messy ambiguity and unknowability, their relationship with nature, a complex expression of their multifaceted psyches. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was fascinating. I love the way that you've used the contemporary work or other work of Ruth Murray to expand on our understanding of the work that we've got in our collection, and also both the classical and the pre-Raphaelite connections with that particular piece of work. I was also interested to know where you actually found all that information about Ruth Murray. Is there a particular publication you've accessed, or is it online, or where did you actually unearth all that from?
Oh, it was a bit of digging round actually. So some of it, her statement came from her website. So she has a website which is I think it's just as her name, to be perfectly honest. But also she's on social media, so she's on Instagram, and there are also I've found she has exhibited. So I found there weren't very many kind of critical reviews of her, but I did find some reviews of some exhibitions that she'd been part of. And then you just kind of follow your nose a bit and go down rabbit holes. So yeah. But most of the images I found from her website. But she's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a whole other kind of strand that she does, which is maybe subject for another talk. She does a lot of images of young women in interiors, and that has a whole many of the things I think that were interesting in these kind of images in the natural world, the kind of ambiguity and the self-possession of the figures is apparent in paintings where she has women in interiors. But then there's something else happening. But I think she's incredibly interesting as an artist, actually.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I mean, as I said, it's enlightened me in terms of putting the work that we've got in our collection in a much broader context. A couple of comments we've had. A comment that in relation to one of the images, and possibly you could say this about most of them, is that the image looked photographic rather than painting. And actually, when you look at the image that we've got, or the painter we've got in our collection, it does look photographic, but then, and you made reference to this, if you look at it really carefully, it becomes quite abstract in the way that the paint has been applied quite loosely, although quite amazingly, she manages to create that almost photorealistic detail.
yeah.
And then somebody else saying that it was fantastic. She hadn't actually seen any work from Muthro before, so I think that's again enlightening. So, thank you very much for that, Lindsay. We're now going to move on to John's presentation, who's going to talk about Britain's first awakening to Impressionists. I'm now going to hand over to John. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Richard, and good evening, everybody. And it's great to be back with you as ever. There's certainly a current awakening to Impressionism in Britain, particularly Monet, because as some of you will probably know, there is a much praised exhibition at the Courtauld Gallery that brings together 21 views of the River Thames, which Monet painted began during his visits between 1899 and 1901. It's interesting, you'll see this particular one has a fairly long gestation period, as indeed do some of the others, because by this time he'd stopped completing paintings sort of, en plein air. Only part of it would be sketched on location. The rest would be completed in his studios back in Giverny. This is an example of one such. I have to say this, I have a personal connection with this. You can't see this, but it's immediately above the screen on the wall behind it. I blundered on a visit to Stuttgart back in 2012 into the big gallery there, the Staats Gallery. And they were having a special exhibition linking the work of Turner with Monet and also the American artist Twombly. And this was almost the first thing I saw. And at the time, I'd just turned 60. I'd given up my season ticket at the Etihad. I was doing some very rewarding voluntary work, but I wanted more. And when I saw this, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew nothing about art at that time. But for the first time, I just realized the emotional connection that one can have with a work of art. And who's to know, what the rationale for that is? I still don't know. It still sort of conveys a feeling of mystery to me. It reminds me of something that Monet once said. He said, for me, the subject is of secondary importance. I want to convey what is alive between me and the subject. In other words, the visual sensation that he gets, rather than whatever it is that's out there beyond the mist or the fog or whatever it is. Now, of course, Monet was in London several times between 1899 and 1901, as I've said. It wasn't his first visit to London. He'd first come to London 1870 to 71 with Camille Pissarro, and the story goes that they were fleeing from the Franco-Prussian War that had broken out. And there they met Paul Durand-Ruel, who, an art dealer, a major art dealer, who took a lot of risks. I mean, he almost bankrupted himself from time to time, such was the outlay of his own resources, but he had a passionate belief in the new movement of Impressionism. And he did a very good job of selling the work of the artist, almost always to private collections. And indeed, those series that were completed in 1904, that series in 1904, they'd actually been on display in Paris in that very year. And it was Monet's ambition to have another exhibition in the city where they were located, which was London. But Durand-Ruel had done too good a job of selling them. So they were no longer available. However, what did happen in London the very next year, 1905, was Durand-Ruel's biggest extravaganza of all. It was at the Grafton Galleries in Mayfair, and it was all the great French Impressionists, a lot of their work, a very representative sample of their work, on display to be seen by the British public. Now, he had organized smaller scale exhibitions in Britain before, in London before, but never on this scale. And the art critic for the Sunday Times, Philip Rutter, was so moved by this that he organized a campaign to buy a painting by Monet for the nation. And enough was raised to buy this one, Lavacour Under Snow. Lavacour is on a bend on the River Seine. And as you can just see, although this has many of the characteristics that we would expect in a French Impressionist painting, we see not so much the object or the subject as an approximation of it. And the further back you go, the more the imagination has to take over as the senses give out. But you can just about see that the Seine has frozen, which is an interesting point, because back then the Seine used to freeze about every 15 years. Now it hasn't frozen for more than 60 years. And of course, we can all guess at the reasons as to why that might be. However, the National Gallery, and this sounds incredible when you hear it from the standpoint of 2024, they declined. They begged to be excused. They didn't want it, partly because they didn't want a Monet, and partly because they didn't want any association at all with Durand-Ruel. Interestingly, it was bought by an art dealer called Hugh Lane. And Hugh Lane tragically died on board the Lusitania, the Cunard liner that was torpedoed by an enemy submarine off Ireland in 1915. And that brought into focus the Hugh Lane bequest that was contested legally, but part of it, or some of all of it for part of the time went to the National Gallery. For the remainder of the time, it goes to the Hugh Lane Gallery in Parnell Square in Dublin. And that included this. And so almost inadvertently, the National Gallery acquired the very first Monet to enter a public collection in Britain. Now, of course, they have 17, most of them acquired during the second half of the 20th century, and that's in the midst of a French Impressionist collection of about 80 altogether. In fairness, I mean, rather like the Louvre, the National Gallery is primarily a collection of historic art that is sort of pre-19th century, really, and certainly pre-20th century. Now, such was the reach of Durand Ruel that in 1907, having launched many exhibitions elsewhere, we find him in Manchester. Indeed, we find him in Manchester Art Gallery, or certainly his representatives. Late 1907 into early 1908, Manchester Art Gallery buys, I think, 3 works by French Impressionists. And because they bought 3, and because the show did so well, they were given 3 as well. And this was one of the ones that we given. Droulan, I think, is in not Normandy, in Brittany. And I've always loved this because it almost looks as though it's been drawn with wax crayons. It's the most agreeable sight. I find that it delights the senses. And we last had that on display in 2017 at the time of the Winford Dewhurst exhibition at Manchester Art Gallery. And I'll come on to that in a moment. By the way, for all of the Manchester paintings, I'm also putting, perhaps unusually, the date of acquisition, because it is interesting that, you know, Manchester was fairly early on, you know, ahead of the game, perhaps in acquiring Impressionist paintings for a public gallery. Yes, so many people know about this, even if it isn't often displayed these days. It's still a very popular card in the shop. Not sure where those red lines have come from, but we won't worry too much about those. Winford Dewhurst was born in Manchester. That, of course, makes us very proud of him. He was anxious to visit the city of light that Paris was, and he heads out there in 1891, and he enrolls at the School of Fine Arts there, and he's enthralled. He's particularly enthralled by the Impressionists, and particularly by Monet. Indeed, that exhibition that I mentioned did have the subtitle of Manchester's Monet. And when you look at this, and you look at how he's put different colours next to one another, giving the impression of flickering light, this is Croissant, which is in sort of central France, where he went with his family every year. And indeed, it's believed that his family are depicted there, though nobody could possibly recognise them. That's often the way with Impressionist painting. And you can see something of the town behind in a kind of Impressionist haze. The thing about Dewhurst was that he painted probably for another 20 years after this, but he never really moved on. He always painted in exactly this style. But we also remember him as a writer as well. This work by him in 1904, its central message really was, it was almost an indictment of the collection of art by public galleries in Britain, because he said, Monet, one of the greatest artists of our time in 1904, is not represented in a single public gallery anywhere in the United Kingdom. And he said there's almost a kind of phobia, or certainly a dislike of Impressionism, partly because maybe it's from another country. And this is when he began to develop a controversial argument. He made the case that, that really the origins of Impressionism were in this country, not in France. And therefore, somewhere down, deep inside us, we should be able to connect. I don't know if anyone else has seen these red lines. I really don't know where they've come from, but I'll carry on regardless. So he did say Constable. Certainly, he thought that you could see the origins of Impressionism in Constable. And indeed, when the Haywain was shown at the Royal Academy in 1821, it met with mixed reviews at best. Did much better at the Paris Salon 3 years later. He was always much more appreciated in France than he was in his home country. But somebody said to him in 1821, the Haywain is unfinished. And he said, yes, it's unfinished. It's unfinished because nature is unfinished. And I wonder if that's what the Impressionists do. I wonder if they represent something or convey something of the incompleteness of nature. This is a painting, of course, much loved, that we have, the nearest we have to a late Turner oil painting, and yet it's from his mid-period. It's, we've not had this on display for quite a long time. We wouldn't necessarily describe it as impressionist, but we certainly would describe it as atmospheric. And I always think there's a kind of curvature, a kind of force field that seems to go through the waves and round and up through the clouds and then down and then back into the water. And it's perhaps useful to remember that Turner was fascinated by science, by the many scientific developments of his day, and he knew quite well Francis Beaufort, who many of us will know is remembered in the Beaufort scale of winds. It could be that something of that interest is reflected in this. And then a much later work. It's works like this that say, oh, well, Turner was the first Impressionist, really long before the Impressionists had the first exhibition in Paris in 1874. But I wonder, again, whether, superficially, yes, it does resemble an Impressionist painting. But once again, he had a particular scientific interest at this time. He was on particularly good terms with Mary Somerville, the female scientist and astronomer and mathematician, and founder, of course, of Somerville College, Oxford, or it's certainly named after her, but also a great friend of Michael Faraday, who, of course, was experimenting in electricity and magnetism. And I can see something of a magnetic field in this. And I wonder whether perhaps, we said Monet is not in, he said he's not interested in the subject so much as what's going on between him and the subject. I wonder if Turner's more interested in the subject to the extent that he's trying to get deeper, he's trying to get down to some underlying reality that is scarcely visible. Now, often it's believed that the term Impressionism does come from this 1872 painting by Monet, where we see this almost magical, well, it looks magical to us now, this interplay of fog, steam, smoke, ripples on the water, the light from a rising sun. And yet it was this that, of course, gave rise to so much derision. But the Impressionists, being the rebels that they were, wore the derision as a badge of honor. So when the term Impressionism was given as an insult by the press, yes, they were proud to have it. The interesting thing about this is that again, I think someone said to Monet, it's incomplete. And Monet said, yes, of course, it's incomplete because that's how we live life. A word that we very often use when we're looking at Impressionism is evanescence, you know, that fleeting moment when something possibly very, very beautiful, to the extent that it's beyond the power of words to describe, it's there for a split second and then it goes. And of course, this will go because the sun will rise, maybe the fog will evaporate, and everything will change. The story goes again, of course, that yes, they came, the Impressionists, particularly Monet and Pissarro, came to London, and then they spent a lot of time in the National Gallery, and they looked at Monet's painting, especially Rain, Steam and Speed. And then they all started painting like him. But somebody once put this to Monet, and Monet said, no, please don't compare me with Turner at all. I learned from Turner, but I don't want to be compared with him because Turner's a romantic. He paints visions, he paints dreams, whereas I paint what I see, exactly what I see in the moment. Of course, artistic taste in Britain in terms of the public galleries was still probably very conservative during what, after all, was the mid-Victorian era. James McNeill Whistler was American-born. He was born in Massachusetts, but of course, from quite an early age, after he'd been in the army, spent a lot of time in Britain and in France, and Britain really became his adoptive country. Not Turner in Black and Gold. I don't think it counts as an Impressionist painting. I mean, Whistler was certainly in contact with the Impressionists to the extent that he was invited to take part in that first 1874 exhibition, but he declined. This is the very painting that was the subject of notoriety because it was actually argued over in a libel trial in 1878. John Ruskin had said some very disobliging things about this when it was on show at the Grosvenor Gallery. And he basically said, well, this is the gist of it. We are being invited to pay 200 guineas, which was its price tag, for a pot of paint being hurled at the public. Whistler was angered by this, and he decided to sue Ruskin. And well, Ruskin's barrister, Sir John Holker, one of the finest legal minds of the day, cross-examined Whistler and said, well, how long did it take you to paint this? And Whistler said, probably 2 days. And he said, you expect to receive 200 guineas for 2 days' work? He said, no, sir, I ask it for the knowledge of a lifetime. Both men were ruined by it, and Whistler was bankrupt the following year because, yes, he won, but he was awarded 1 farthing, the lowest coin of the realm, and he had to pay half the costs as well. You see, the interesting thing is that in Britain, there was very much a preference for narrative painting at that time. This is probably my favorite work up at the moment. It's absorbed me for so many different reasons. Captive Andromache by Frederick Leighton. And as you see, it almost came straight off the easel when we acquired it. It's a painting that it's a painting that seems to it conveys something of the classical world. There's a definite narrative to it. That's what the Victorians wanted. Something that was part of or which told the story. And there's no great surprise about that because, of course, the Victorian Asian literature was a great one. As we've said, classical references and some kind of moral reflection. you know, that was very much decided, and that was very much the kind of work which Manchester Art Gallery was acquiring when it became Manchester Art Gallery and was no longer the Royal Manchester Institution, I think in 1882. Now, again, we're going to look now very quickly at some British Impressionists, and we're going to look at their inspiration, and we're going to consider briefly whether we can think of them genuinely as Impressionists. Certainly they were, you know, they all drew their inspiration from France, and they all visited France at roughly the same time in the early 1880s. And some of them did enroll at the School of Fine Art. The Grey Dress by Walter Sickert, and I include him and I include this because he was very much under the tutelage of Whistler when he painted this. And with this one, he'd been in Dieppe with Whistler in 1884 when he was on his honeymoon there. Sickert had a 4-decade association with Dieppe and lived there for 6 years, I think between about 1898 and about 1904. And this is a monument to Abraham Duquesne, who was an admiral, or certainly a naval officer in the French Navy during the reign of Louis XIV, and then later in the Swedish Navy. And what people admire about this are the fluctuations of light on the facade at the back, the dark and brooding effect that he has of the monument in the foreground. Jules Bastien Lepage, who was a great influence on the artist, one of the artists that Lindsay mentioned, Annie Swinnerton, he grew up in the midst of the orchards and vineyards in a rural part of France. He had a tremendous admiration for nature to the point that he felt it should be represented in a non-idealistic way. He preached on plein air painting in the open air. And I include it because 1879 was the year of his first visit to Britain. And he found himself followed by a lot of British artists, many of whom crossed the Channel in the early 1880s in a bid to create or to portray nature in the way Lepage did. One of those was George Clausen or Clausen. Like Sickert, he was of Danish descent. And this is interesting because there's a kind of an impressionistic haze around the girl's head. And it leads us to wonder, you know, just how valid the term impressionist is. Do we mean that it does belong to the movement of Impressionism that began in France? Or does it mean anything that's sort of indistinct? Because if it means anything that's indistinct, then Impressionism is probably as old as art. And, you know, we have paintings from much further back that could be said to bear Impressionist influences. It's interesting because back in 1886, that was the year that a number of British artists formed the new English Art Club. They were fed up of trying to exhibit at the Royal Academy, where the tastes, they believe, were far too conservative. But by 1908, when this was painted, George Clausen was back in the Royal Academy. He was a full-time member of it. Indeed, he was a professor of painting by that time. And many would say, well, this certainly is very much in the Impressionist style. Although when people look at this, they say, yeah, but it's not like Monet's haystacks, where Monet's concerned with the light effects. What Clausen is also doing is trying to convey something of the English landscape. Certainly you do get that wonderful feel of atmospheric feel of a beautifully crisp morning. I said it was a good year for Impressionism because Sir John Lavery is another of the British Impressionists, who currently has a show, an exhibition. So that should say Ulster. I am sorry about that. Ulster Museum, Belfast. The exhibition is on at the Royal Scottish Academy. Sir John Lavery again, Paris in the early 1880s, and again enthralled by the inspiration that comes from the various artists, some of which we've mentioned. But that show at the Royal Scottish Academy is on until the 29th of this month. I think this is beautiful. And if you look at this one, it's the same bridge. And yet the evanescence of two moments more than 15 years apart. Grez, by the way, was I think it's about 40 or so miles south of Paris, and it was at one time a great colony for artists, a community for artists. And as you can see, we have our own Sir John Lavery painted in an Impressionist style. Indeed, back in 1981, this painting was used for the front cover of the Oxford University Press edition of Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. And indeed, Henry James was one of Whistler's advocates at that notorious trial in 1878 that we've mentioned. Our final Impressionist, Philip Wilson Steer, and he was one of these people who said, well, Impressionism wasn't invented in the 1860s or 70s. It went much further back than that. This is a truly beautiful work. Many say that it's out of Monet's textbook. Cowes is 198 years old, the Cowes Regatta. Again, very atmospheric. He captures not just the interplay of light. Look at the way he's represented the sky and the water in different ways, but also he conveys the feeling of conveyance, of speed. You can see the billowing wind you can't see the wind, but you can see the effect in the sails. Interestingly, the New English Art Club that had been founded in their 1888 exhibition, and this was part of it, it got a very rough ride from some of the press. The Daily Telegraph didn't like it at all. They didn't like Philip Wilson Steer's work. Manchester Guardian simply said that Steer was nothing more than an imitator of Monet, who was himself, they said, an imitator. But the greatest ire came from a magazine called The Pictorial World, who said that Steer's work was eccentric, vulgar, foggy, and it was nothing more than spectacled impressionism. Usually, of course, criticisms like that are written by people who wouldn't know what to do with the paintbrush. And this is the final work. It's not one of ours, but I think it's, of all the works, and there are many, if you look at Art UK, I think this is the most beautiful, and it does come from that very formative period in the 1880s and early 1890s. Warbur's Wick, I had to look it up. It's on the Suffolk coast, about 20 miles south of Lowestoft. And again, it was an artist colony, and he lived near there for a while. And many Impressionist painters gathered there. It's often said that with Philip Wilson Steer, he goes against something that you find in earlier Impressionism. It's often said that in Impressionism, there's no narrative, there's no story, there's only the moment. And yet, in Philip Wilson Steer, it's said by people who know far more about it than I ever could, that we do get a sense of what has happened and what is about to happen and what's going on and who the people are. If there is, it escapes me. All I can say is that it conveys to me that wonderful feeling that when we recall the endless, carefree summer of childhood. And I'm going to finish on a quotation, not about Philip Wilson Steer, but about Walter Sickert. And Jonathan Traynor, who's a friend of mine at the gallery and a member of the VS staff, drew my attention to this. And it came from Walter Sickert's first wife, Ellen Cobden. And she says it of her former husband, but I think it could be said of many of the Impressionist paintings. But she said of him, he was like a spirit from another world in which nobody seemed to be very sad. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, John. Well, when you started, and you mentioned this at the beginning of your presentation, you said you knew nothing about art. Well, thank you for all sharing with us all that fantastic knowledge that you've gained over time. I mean, it certainly broadened my understanding of the term Impressionism and put it into an English context, which I think has been really helpful and really informative. So thank you so much for sharing that with us this evening. We're just slightly after 7 o'clock, so very briefly, I'd just like to mention our next presentation, which will be on the 13th of November. It will be Pauline talking about Manchester and the suffragette movement, and myself, the title I've chosen is about Time for Art, and I'll just leave that with you to kind of wonder what on earth that might be all about. So thank you for your comments. Everybody's saying how interesting the presentations are. The presenters are just going to remain online, but if the participants could just remove themselves from the presentations from the Zoom link,